Thank you, Taeyun. Let me pick up precisely where my dear friend Shai Lavi left us. What does it say about these times? What hidden truth does it reveal? What work is it doing for us to gather here, all of us from around the world, here in Jerusalem of all places, to discuss the fourth force of myth today? What does this gathering tell us about our times and about us? There are some clues in the stunning program written by our brilliant hosts and organizers, Jacob Abulafia, who has been working on the myth of prisons and punishment, Carmen Dege, who just finished a dissertation on the relationship between myth and critique, and Taeyun Keum, who has just published an extraordinary book on myth in Plato and its reception. There are clues and signposts in the program. Post-truth, it is written. Conspiracy theory. Instrumentalized myths, and its relation to truth. Are we in 1933 or 1946? There are clues and signs in the titles of the papers and keynotes. The brilliant Chiara Bottici, author of A Philosophy of Political Myth, will train her keynote on the founding narratives of US white supremacy. Professor Pini Ifrigan will deliver his keynote on Hans Blumenberg's myth theory, perhaps along a similar vein intellectually, at least insofar as Chiara's work is consonant with Blumenberg's theory of myth as ongoing work on myth. I notice Simone de Beauvoir, who Adam Kellgren, of course, notes in an excellent recent article, equates myth with deceit or false discourse. Of course, but on the other hand, we see Friedrich Schiller's Philosophy of Mythology with Martin Puig. We see Georges Sorel, the great defender of myth, in Kevin Duong's paper. We have Alexandre Kojève, my favorite, with Kyle Moore's paper. Perhaps even more telling, though, are some of the missing thinkers on the program. Freud, Jung, Lévi-Strauss. Where have they gone? What work will we be doing individually and even more collectively in a world historical sense in relation to myth? Your interventions will not be anodyne. They cannot be. Each and every one of your papers will undoubtedly represent one piece, one contribution, one dimension to a collective enterprise that will mark this very moment, this precise moment in history. And as each of you present, I know I will be asking myself, and perhaps later generations will be asking themselves, what are you doing to our collective imaginary? Even more importantly, how are you shaping our praxis? Because you, more than anyone, you who study myth and the history of usage, you know how myth can be used to transform the world, not just interpret it. Will you create or deploy myths yourselves to convince us or others, as Plato does in the Republic, as Taeyun brilliantly describes and writes about in her book, Plato and the Mythic Tradition in Political Thought and its Reception, right? Shall we too try to find a role for myth in our political theories? Or will you diminish myth, use it as a foil in order to elevate our own techne, our science, our reason, as Enlightenment thinkers did? Or instead, like the German Romantics, will you redeem and valorize myth? Shall we appropriate myth together for these postmodern times? Or will we weaponize myth or critique the weaponization of myth in Donald Trump's Make America Great Again? Or through Donald Trump's mythic creations, as Matthew Longo writes about in his article, Citizenship versus a Surveillance State, the mythic creation of the caravan, right? The incoming invasion of immigrants from Central America. And will we use that to defang Trump? Or will we use it to frighten us into action? Should we deploy myth, as some feminist critical theorists propose, Rosie Braidotti and others, as Adam again details in his article, Myth Making as a Feminist Strategy? Those are the questions we will be asking. I will be listening to better understand what each of you are doing with myth, and even more collectively, what this remarkable convening in Jerusalem represents politically. Reflexivity. You can hear it in what I'm saying, right? That reflexivity at the core of critique. Carmen, we were talking about that a few weeks ago. Reflexivity, which is and of course, critique is in the title of the conference. Reflexivity. What is it that we are doing to our object of study? How are we transforming it, right? And at the same time, how are we ourselves shaped by our situation with regard to myth? Our own positions shaped by the Enlightenment myth of reason, right? And our post-Enlightenment skepticism, shaped by the realities of climate change and COVID-19 that dramatically transformed our relationship to the classic Freudian triptych of myth, religion, and science? Or how are we shaped by the eerie parallels of current white supremacist myth to the early Aryan superiority myths, by that specter of a reborn fascism today? How do all those circumstances shape us as critical thinkers? How do we then affect our subject of study? And more importantly, how do we remain true to that reflexivity and not simply impose our prefabricated theories? How do we avoid doing critique as a prêt-à-porter? I mean, one of my deepest disappointments with Adorno and Horkheimer is how they somewhat uncritically, I would say, overlaid a Marxist framework over the story of Odysseus and his confrontation with the sirens in Book 12 of the Odyssey. It failed to explore, say, the gender dimensions and stereotypes. You'll recall in their discussion in the dialectic of the Enlightenment of the Ulysses and the sirens, Horkheimer and Adorno speak about the mastery over nature entailing the exploitation of man by man. And they describe how the oarsmen were transformed into laborers and then to the proletariat and ultimately to factory workers, right? As they write, the oarsmen who cannot speak to one another are each of them yoked in the same rhythm as the modern worker in the factory. And the myth of the sirens became a story of class warfare. Oarsmen became factory workers. But how much did they miss in that interpretation? About, for instance, just the obvious gender dimensions of that story. What could they have done with the myth of the sirens to show how it reestablished a gendered ideology where women are portrayed as the temptress, as the monster, as killers and eaters of men, where women seduce men and destroy them, and how Odysseus inscribes himself in that precise social order? His actions ultimately defeat the sirens. In the end, he becomes master of them, but he does not succumb. But in triumphing over nature, he further reinforces those gender hierarchies. A missed opportunity, I would argue. Charles Clavey may want to correct me on my reading. He'll be speaking about the myth of exchange and dialectic of enlightenment, but I think this is still right. The point being, of course, how can we, critical theorists, remain truly reflexive, open, critical in the face of myth, so that we recognize what we are doing as we play with myth and stay focused, of course, on the most important dimension of critique, which is praxis. So here is one proposal. One proposal for this morning in Jerusalem. Perhaps by the end of the conference, I will disavow it. But what I'd like to do in thinking about myth is neither to valorize it nor to impugn myth, not to project too much into myth. To begin, chastened in part by the dangers of myth. Chiara reminds us, of course, drawing on Cassiro's work, she writes, myth is a sort of enchanted mirror in which scholars have found the objects with which each is most familiar. The linguists found a world of signs and names, the psychologist a product of the unconscious, the philosophers both the opposite of philosophy and a form of critical philosophy, and so on. How can we advance while trying to avoid those shoals, trying to avoid those fallacies? I think cautiously. Every student of myth has recognized ever since the Enlightenment endeavor to cast myth as primitive, the dual nature or the dual connotations of myth that ambiguate its use. On the one hand, myth as an early literary or oral form, simply a particular historical identifiable form of human narration and understanding. On the other hand, myth as falsity and illusion. Taeyun writes about this in relation to Blumenberg, where she writes, we are accustomed to a fairly specific meaning of myth as a kind of traditional literary genre of tales about supernatural figures or events. But from the Enlightenment onward, this genre also came to double as a philosophical concept, often as a catch-all category for the opposite of critical reason, a foil for philosophy or irrationality at large. Now, I'd like to try and keep those somewhat distinct and propose the following, that myths, those stories that we know from ancient myths and that recur in different times and different spaces, become familiar to us, and as such become second nature. We come to know them. They become shorthand for an idea or a set of ideas that we project on the myths. The myths don't inherently have those meanings, we project them. So here I'm kind of rejecting the Freudian idea, for instance, that totem is all about the Oedipal complex or something. We project these onto myths, but those meanings then become second nature to us or to a community of interpreters. And of course, they can be transformed, they can be distorted. They are interpretations, and interpretations, of course, as Nietzsche taught us, as Foucault taught us, are infinite. But at times, they gel. So for instance, book 23 of the Iliad, the chariot race between Antilochus and Menelaus that Foucault discusses in his first lecture at Louvain. Foucault interprets it, and it's come down to us, at least readers of Foucault's, reflecting the ways in which our youth can trick us in believing we are better than our elders. Or if you don't want to consider Homer's chariot race a myth, even though, of course, Athena sees Apollo's sabotage or protege Diomedes and then attacks Apollo's protege Eumolus and throws him off his chariot. If you'd rather take another story, something like Icarus, son of Daedalus, who flies too close to the sun. There too, we may see the ways in which youth misleads us into overestimating our powers. Shared interpretations, shared meanings for certain communities. Let's take the myth that's always intrigued me the most, the myth of natural order, the myth of a divine order that maintains itself, the idea of homeostasis, of a self-regulating mechanism that reaches equilibrium on its own, that corrects itself, that keeps itself in harmony and in balance. The myth of natural order, of divine order, of spontaneous equilibrium would give birth at a moment in history to the illusion of the free market. The idea that there could be an externally unregulated space that left to its own could self-regulate and achieve equilibrium. This is, of course, a form of equilibrium and an idea of natural order, of course, only in the economic context, never in the context of punishment, not ever in the carceral world. Of course, a topic that Devin Singh may talk about later today. But it's important here to distinguish between the myths we all know, we learned in school, we read in Greek mythology, we see in paintings and hear in songs, in the brilliant 1959 romantic tragedy, Black Orpheus, for instance, to distinguish these myths from historically situated illusions. In other words, let me propose this. There are myths we know, the myth of natural order, and then there are historically specific constructions, illusions that do an extraordinary amount of political work and that use myth instrumentally as code almost, as something second nature, something familiar that we need, as shorthand for an idea that is familiar to us. So that the historically situated illusion, for instance, the illusion of free markets that emerges with the physiocrats and Adam Smith, works better. It has more traction. It's more convincing. It's more compelling because it refers to, points to, incorporates, borrows from those myths we know so well and we understand silently. Silently. I think this is a different definition or a use or relationship of myth to illusion, which is in the title of our conference, than, for instance, Chiara's definition in A Philosophy of Political Myth. She defines political myth there as follows: a political myth can be defined as the work on a common narrative by which the members of a social group or society make significance of their political experiences and deeds. Consequently, what makes a political myth out of a simple narrative is not its content or its claim to truth, but the fact that this narrative creates significance that is shared by a group and that it affects the specific political conditions in which the group operates. That notion of a political myth is very copious, right? It's very copious in the sense that it is trying to capture the notions of shared significance that are pieced together through narrative. But it doesn't draw a distinction between myth and illusion. And in fact, there's a discussion in Chiara's book about Raymond Aron and the question of ideology, in which she tries to distinguish myth from ideology, right? But I would suggest a slightly different relationship. Perhaps a relationship that has more of a sociological dimension. And here I might be closer to Vasfie Toprak, who's going to talk about towards a sociology of political myth. I'm not sure. But what I would say is that myth is so useful when there is a common cultural understanding, when we have shared meanings, when we have projected onto them shared interpretations, and then they can serve as this shortcut, as a shorthand, a piece of code, almost a piece of DNA, encoded DNA, that empower an illusion and give an illusion its historical traction. Let me give you an illustration. This one, again, related to the myth of natural order, but in a different context and related to a different illusion. It would be amusing if it were not so troubling. I'll start with a clip. I'll start with a clip from the famous and greatest, perhaps, popularizer of myth in our modern times, Joseph Campbell. You'll recall, of course, in a series that was called not The Force of Myth, but The Power of Myth, the PBS, wildly popular PBS television series from the 1980s, Bill Moyers in discussion with the, well, literature professor, but mythologist, Joseph Campbell. And the conversation in the first episode here is turning to the notion of Gaia, the Gaia Principle, Gaia, Mother Earth, the myth of Mother Earth. A term, of course, more recently popularized by Bruno Latour. Let me show the clip quickly, and then let me discuss it with you.
Living in Hawaii, and we're living right by the ocean, and have a little lanai, a little porch, and there's a coconut tree that grows up through the porch, and there's a kind of vine plant, with leaves like this, that has grown up the coconut tree. Now that plant sends forth little seeds to go out and cleanse the plant and it knows where the plant is and what to do, and where the tree is, and it goes up like this, and it opens a leaf, and that leaf immediately turns to where the sun is. Now you can't tell me that leaf doesn't know where the sun is going to be. All of the leaves go just like that, what's called heliotropism, and turn toward where the sun is. That's full consciousness. There's a plant consciousness. There's a animal consciousness. We share all of these things. You eat certain foods, and the bile knows whether there's something there for it to go to work on. I mean, it's consciousness. I begin to feel more and more that the whole world is conscious. Certainly the vegetable world is conscious. When you live in the woods, as I did as a kid, you can see all these different consciousnesses relating to themselves. Scientists are beginning to talk quite openly about the Gaia Principle. They want the whole planet as an organism. You see, if you will think of ourselves as being thrown in here from somewhere else, So we are the earth. We are the consciousness of the earth. These are the eyes of the earth. And this is the voice of the earth. What else?
What else? What else? Scientists, Bill Moyer interrupts, are beginning to talk quite openly about the Gaia Principle. Yes, indeed, they were. Starting in the 1980s, they were starting to talk about the Gaia Principle. Scientists, that is. Scientists, and of course you know the Gaia Principle, the idea that the Earth is an organism that protects itself and tries to achieve a homeostatic equilibrium for life on Earth. That Mother Earth finds ways to counter the nefarious effects of global climate change. As Leah Aronoff proposed, Gaia proposes that through a series of tightly coupled biochemical feedback loops, the whole of planetary life collectively and autonomously works to maintain the planet's environmental conditions within a narrow range of habitability. Remarkable, isn't it? Indeed, scientists began to talk about the Gaia Principle, and many of us today have internalized that hopeful story about the ways in which the Earth may be able to protect itself. As Robert Siegel writes, Gaia, quote, is about the ability of the Earth to save itself and to do so intentionally. Scientists are beginning to talk about Gaia. But as Leah Aronofsky documents, and perhaps one of the most brilliant uses of discourse analysis in recent time, it's a paper called Gas Guzzling Gaia in Critical Inquiry in the winter 2021. All of this talk of Gaia was made possible instead by a long collaboration between an independent scientist by the name of James Lovelock, a mythical name, and Royal Dutch Shell. Through a lengthy, financially remunerative working relationship, Lovelock, an independent scientist, documented instances of biological processes that recuperated a certain balance on Earth. In a series of Shell-sponsored research, Lovelock discovered different organisms, sulfur-excreting algae or iodine-emitting seaweeds, whose biological processes counteracted the climate destabilizing mechanisms of other activities, especially human behaviors and fossil fuels. He documented those forms of life that countered the destructive effect of oil and gas. And he came to argue, as Leah writes, that the metabolic off-gassing of these tiny organisms were evidence of a kind of regulatory response, one meant to neutralize the warming effect. He began his journey in the early 1970s, a program of research sponsored by Shell, discovering algae that emitted sulfur, and then evolved into a theory with more Shell-supported research, trying to document how natural agents counteracted climate change. And he pushed this further to the idea that there was a certain adaptability onto the earth. Then he turned to the notion of Gaia. It was suggested to him, and he embraced it. And of course, it became the way in which we understood this new idea that maybe the earth could protect itself. In 1975, Gaia reached an even wider audience with a kind of feature story in the New Scientific, an industry-friendly magazine, as Leer writes, that Lovelock co-authored, and the cover of it is a picture of the planet Earth. It's all about the Gaia Principle. It's now in the New Scientist, in a piece co-authored by Lovelock and Sidney Epton, who was an upper-level manager at Shell. The rest of the story, of course, is history. In the mid-1970s, DuPont recruits Lovelock and testifies before Congress. And we have what Caroline Biltoft might call a hermeneutics of misinformation that takes place. Lovelock becomes the proponent of this notion of self-regulation. And what would it give us ultimately? Let me show you what it would give us ultimately. Here is a statement, a communique from Exxon, what would become ExxonMobil in 1985. To those who think industry and nature cannot coexist, we say, show a little respect for Mother Nature. She is one strong lady, resilient and capable of rejuvenation. The environment recovers well from both natural and man-made disasters. Now, does this justify or lessen the impact of industrial pollution? Of course not. Our main point is that nature, over the millennia, has learned to cope. Mother Nature is pretty successful in taking on human nature. Now, Leah traces in this article, in her own words, the conditions of possibility of climate change denialism, the epistemic and conceptual conditions that made certain statements about fossil fuels' effects on the climate not only possible, but also plausible. I think this is the perfect illustration of how the myth, right, which we were familiar with, which essentially Joseph Campbell was talking about in such mythic and convincing terms, right? Oh, the heliotropic, of course, what else, right? How those myths then become the code that allows us to say 1,000 words in one, and that allows us then to create illusions. It is perhaps a process with a bit of bricolage, as Nicole Hockner would say, one of our interveners here. In her chapter Historiographie de l'image royale, she writes, le terme de bricolage peut donc nous permettre de suivre les processus de fabrication des mythes. It might be. I've argued elsewhere that critique is the constant and perpetual unveiling of illusions, right? And what myth would play in this role would be a part of those construction of those illusions and unveiling them, of course. Not to find the truth, I argue, but to find another illusion. What of praxis, then? Of course, the more important dimension, right? Carmen, what of praxis? There's no doubt that myth, as well as illusion, can be weaponized. They are by the right. Chiara will be addressing this in her keynote on Wednesday. Plato used myth as well, as we know, Tae-Yoon, and was received as such. Johnny Thacker will be talking about Plato as well. There's no monopoly on the deployment of myth. Some think it's practically inevitable that they would form part of political discourse. And there are those, of course, who support the use of myth and the deployment of myth. We need only turn, of course, to Georges Sorel or to Marx, right? Marx and the myth of the victorious workers' revolution. Etienne Balibar has this beautiful passage in a chapter in Marxist Capital after 150 years, where he traces the connection of Marx's expression, right? The expropriators will be expropriated, right? This passage, it's in volume 1 at the end of chapter 24, section 7, right? Where Marx is talking about the monopoly of capitalism, and the knell of capitalist private property sounds, and then he ends, the expropriators are expropriated. And of course, Etienne traces that back to the book of Isaiah, where it's written, and the people shall take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel shall possess them in the land of the Lord for servants and handmaids, and they shall take them captives, whose captives they were, and they shall rule over their oppressors. Right? The expropriators shall be expropriated. Very powerful, powerful myth. So we deploy these so often intentionally, politically. Why not continue? Why haven't I, to the best of my knowledge, intentionally at least? For those of you who've, my turn to Praxis is not one to tell others what to do, but to focus on my own praxis, to ask myself, what more am I to do? Right? And so in that context, the question becomes, what use of myth, what use of illusions? And I have to say that somehow illusions and the intentional use of myth seem to work best when they are authentic, genuine. It doesn't feel to me that the inauthentic or instrumentalized use of myth and illusions just functions as well as something that is truly believed. And in part, ultimately, I might say, that is why ultimately, at least for now, Trump failed. I believe sincerely that he wasn't fully authentic. He was always a bit of a con man. He was not following through. He didn't go to the Capitol himself, right? He let others go for him. He didn't pardon them, those who went on his behalf. He's at a golf club. That's where he is, right? And so I have a sense in which I never thought it was authentic. Of course, 74 million voters maybe did, but still, when you're at the Bedminster Golf Club instead of being at the Capitol, doesn't that tell you something? In any event, there's an element of authenticity or sincerity or genuineness in myth that does a lot of work. And so personally, I'm not sure how one would go about deploying myths and illusions proactively. It's certainly not what I've done in the past. I've always, in some earnest way, been trying to get it right. How paradoxical could that be, right? But of course, in part, maybe that's why the debunking I've been engaged in has never really worked. So it's time for me to close. What will we be doing here in Jerusalem? I hear a hypothesis, something about the right, something about neo-fascism, something about white supremacism. Are we here like those who came after the Third Reich? Is there a way for us, the righteous ones, to take back the higher ground? And not just to get the upper hand politically or philosophically, but to use myth to our advantage? That is my own obsession. But of course, Myths are the enchanted mirror. Thank you.
Should I just begin? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. You've, aside from giving us an incredibly interesting talk, given me more fodder for hating anything involving Royal Dutch Shell, which, given from the standpoint of living in Holland, is great ammo. Okay, so I will take a little bit of liberty here because for two reasons. One, because I think it was an interesting talk, but also it's a pleasure to have you live and in person to ask you questions, which is rare in our business since 99% of the people I read are dead. And I have questions about the argument, including the argument that comes out in different ways in your recent book. And so I'll try to tie them together to capture something, I think, of what you were saying. So the main argument I take, or that I think I want to focus on, is the idea about separating myth and illusion. Because myth, in your talk, repeatedly comes out as something that, while perhaps detrimental or devastating or illusory, is also something that's salvageable. There's something beautiful and powerful about myth, which is something I think all of us believe. And the question of reclaiming or salvaging the beautiful, the normatively valid, motivating part of myth from the illusory is the claim. And I share that claim. I share that belief, and I think probably a lot of people in this virtual room share that belief. But my worry is that I don't, at least, necessarily understand how. And so I wanted to start with an example from my own work, which is about primarily about borders, which, as anyone who's thought about borders, even read the news about borders, is heavily mythologized, right? So it's kind of a ripe subject. It isn't just me exploiting a subject I know. I think it's a relevant topic. Because I spent some time this last weekend trying to see if I could separate and untangle myth and illusion in this case, or taking seriously that project of trying to do so. And I find myself in some trouble or some difficulty doing this. So I'll explain why. So if you take the example of the US-Mexico border, we know, for example, that it's a heavily mythologized border or wall, right? Part of it comes from, if you wanted to distill the mythology, it might be something about civilization and barbarism, right? The kind of pre-modern myth about the barbarians at the gates. And in a way, it does exactly what the work that Bernard was discussing in propping up an illusion. The illusion being that the wall works, that it's effective. Now, this is, in fact, as illusory as the idea that capitalism in free markets exist, right? In fact, walls do very little, and little that's remotely successful. But a lot of the effectiveness, if there is any, of the wall derives from the fact that the illusion is built on the myth. And I take that to be part of what you were saying in your Gaia example, right? So I buy this. I buy all these premises. But here's where I think they become problematic. So I've recently been doing a lot of work on the question of the Berlin Wall. And the story, the mythology behind the wall was that the wall was built to keep out the capitalist invaders, right? This idea that capitalism would flood through and destroy socialism in East Germany. And so it generated the illusion that the wall was an effective means at keeping things out, at deterring. But of course, what happened over time is the illusion fell apart, right? The illusion fell apart in the sense that people realized, in fact, the wall was not effective at keeping anybody out, but it was effective at keeping people in. It was more of a prison, right, than it was the wall of a castle. And so what happened then is it generated new mythologies. The new mythologies in this case went from being a story of civilization and barbarism, the pre-modern myth, to a very Christian myth, that actually the purpose of the wall was to keep people from temptation. because outside there's the capitalist temptation that would destroy socialism if you tried to exit towards it. And so whereas the myth proffered the first illusion, when the illusion fell apart, it generated new myths. And there's this process, there's this entanglement between the two, that the more I try to distinguish, I find it tends to fall apart. I don't know how to. And so the first way to press the point is to ask how and which ways these myth and illusion relate, but in particular, whether or not there's something more complicated than the story as you told it, in the pathway of myth as being the justificatory premise that then supports the illusion. And so that's part of it. I think the other part that comes out of the thinking in this way about whether or not these two things can be disentangled, or if not, or if perhaps the relationship goes in a different direction than I think the talk, or also goes in a different direction, I should say, than the talk suggests, is to talk about then what you think myth is, if it's to be reclaimable. And so in your book, when you talk about illusion, part of the point of the book, right, to attack illusion, to defetishize illusion, you claim on page 208, you write, a theory of illusions attacks purported truths. But the difficulty comes in then when you talk about what you think the force of myth is. Because the force of myth, in your words, is that myth only functions when you believe them, right? This is the claim about the failure of Trump to be authentic. But this point between purported truths, which is the point of your theory that we should be attacking, versus myth, which is something you believe in, even if it may not be valid, hence the something, at least in the genus of purported truth, ends up sounding as though it distills to the claim a theory of illusions doesn't attack purported truth, but attacks myths we might believe in or believe in errantly. And if that's the claim, then we have this sort of difficult kind of problem that faces us, which is not whether we would like to separate myth and illusion, as I think most of us would, but whether we have to face the fact that we can't, or at least it's not obvious how we would, absent some very clear, A, definitional rubric, or B, what I find the more difficult part, the idea that you'd have to actually generate a pathway of how we get from myth into something like believed myth, to something like the kind of myth we believe is also true, to illusion. And I don't exactly know how that pathway would look, but absent it, at least personally, I struggle to conceptualize the difference. And some of this comes out of a general point I have, or a point of difficulty I have in political theory and critical theory, which is that we're often very good at articulating and discussing problems as we understand them, and do a lot of work in thinking about those problems. Take something like human rights. I don't know. We have lots of theories about human rights, but the actual subject of where the moral harm lies is often something we know very little about, absent this sort of abstraction, right? So we understand the problem, but not where the problem comes from or where it begins, and to whom it matters. And so I feel something of the same thing with regard to myth and illusion, which is that I actually want to know when myth becomes illusion, how it becomes illusion, right? So it's not just even a pathway argument, it's almost a generativity argument. And I just simply don't know how to do it. And I often find myself in or I'm now part of a methodological critique in political theory about ethnography, about the importance of going and being live and embody interviewing people and meeting people and inhabiting spaces in which the moral harms we then discuss inhabit. And I think ultimately I leave the talk thinking that we need the same sort of thing, which is that there has to be a way to determine what that illusion is in absent the language we already have for the illusory, right? We know what Marx said, right? About capital. We know what Foucault said about prisons. But in our world, unless we're to take the received wisdom, which in your own theory is precisely the opposite of your point, I don't know how we do. And I wonder whether or not the kind of praxis you describe in your book, which I find quite compelling, ultimately ends up redoubling the problem. And I say this because, you give a very powerful example in the book. And for those who have not read the book, it's about the yellow vests in France. And the question of whether or not you, Bernard, a person, should decide to join the movement. And I find it an incredibly powerful passage, because I think it's something that not only those of us who didn't think that should have thought, it is precisely the direction critical reflexive thinking should go. But I think it also undergirds the very problem with myth, which is that the yellow vests ultimately meant to everyone who saw them precisely what they wanted it to, right? The same thing happened with Occupy Wall Street. People saw in Occupy Wall Street the kind of thing they wished it was, and ultimately projected onto the, in this case, movement, their own received beliefs. So in this case, we have the same kind of problem, which is that the yellow vests, in a certain sense, are the thing we should be self-critical of in our not joining. But the power of myth, of course, as you said, is that it confirms the worldviews we already have. So now we have a circularity, which is that ultimately the things we confront end up confirming the worldviews we bring to them, which is, of course, the problem. And I think that there's an interplay then between the difficulty of any kind of diagnosis when it involves intimate, in-person reflection, which is what you call for, and the distinction of myth and illusion under whose spell we operate. And I don't know how to break that. And I don't think nor do I mean to suggest that there's anything, or even that it can be broken. I don't mean it as a criticism in any way, right? I mean it as an open question that I can't myself resolve. But I wonder if the myth-illusion dichotomy then ends up clarifying and betraying the problem. And I think, so I'll just say one last thing. I realize I'm probably at time. I will say one last final thing, which is that there's something also about the statement that the power of myth, it comes when we believe them as stories, is that the word belief in that sentence carries so much weight, because there is a kind of belief that doesn't have to have a truth claim attached to it at all. And there is a kind of belief that does. And I don't know how to distinguish them, because I begin to wonder whether or not you could make a parallel statement, which is that you could argue the moment we believe in the myths we tell is the moment they become illusions. And that sentence, insofar as it might be persuasive, I think captures the problem as I see it. Okay? And maybe stitches together a little bit the relation of these terms that I find complicated. And again, I mean this in completely friendly fire, because I really do ultimately share the conviction about the reclaiming of myth from illusion and delusion, etc. Okay, thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
both so much. And Bernard, you're welcome to respond to those comments. And we'll also start collecting questions from the audience. If you could use the raise hand function, then that will help us establish a virtual queue. Bernard, would you like to respond to Matthew's comments first, or would you like to also take questions?
Yes, that'd be terrific. Thank you, Matthew, and I deeply appreciate the engagement. And there was a sentence you said at the end that I tried to write down that I want to come back to, which was something about the myths we tell. I don't know if you had it written down or if, but I want to come back to that sentence. I deeply appreciate it. Now, I don't feel as if I am trying to salvage myth. Okay. let me just start there, because there were several times when you were suggesting that I was trying in some way to salvage myth. And I don't think that that's the operative movement I'm making. I am indeed trying to distinguish myth from illusion. And, you know, Freud distinguished illusion from error. In The Future of an Illusion, he didn't have myth in there. And in a way, I wish he had myth in there. And that's what I would like to try and do, is to kind of disarticulate it from what we might call an illusion or a delusion or something like that. And I agree with you that that this is very complex, in part because of the co-constitutive nature here and the feedback loops and whatnot. And I tend not to be someone who tries to reduce the complexity of those feedbacks, but I do feel as if it is possible to distinguish MAGA, Make America Great Again, Trump, 2016 to 2020, let's say, from myths we know of great mythic pasts. And that's the distinction in some way, because the work to understand MAGA plays on those myths that don't then have truth value, in the sense that this isn't a claim that there is a myth that is telling us the truth. It is a shared interpretation. Oftentimes it is not necessarily as politically loaded as the illusion is, in the sense that people from across the political spectrum share a myth of a great past, but that it can use that as a string of argumentation that doesn't need to be said, but that works powerfully in convincing us, or those who are predisposed to believe the illusion, or those who are believing the illusion, to believe it. And here I'm tentatively going to think of some. I don't know if I want to do this, but some psychological work on confirmation bias, the way in which certain things, certain facts we will use to confirm our illusion. In the same, it's possible, I need to think about this, but it's possible that myth plays that role. But I do want to distinguish those. I think you're entirely right. The context of East Germany and the Berlin Wall is fascinating, and the different ways in which kind of geopolitics and relations of power can utilize myths and then get transformed, and will change, and there will be a different valence or a different kind of myth that gets all of a sudden utilized to explain the transformation of the political space. I think that's fascinating. So okay, now, so I think I'm going to try and be quiet because I see so many hands jumping up. So let me just say one last thing. So I agree with you that the ethnography would be extraordinarily important. Here's where someone like Jonathan Metzl's work on whiteness and talking to folks who have experienced that and have turned to Trumpism is vitally important. I agree entirely with that. I disagree, though, with your critique of critical theory here, in the sense that we know the problem, but we don't know where the problem begins. And I think, in fact, that is the crux of the analysis of relations of power, which is to try and figure out where those illusions are beginning. And for instance, whether it's questions of sexuality, whether it's something about diagnoses of homosexuality or etc., right? How it is that those take place and emerge. And in this context, I mean, Chiara will be talking about this more, but in this context, I think that it has to be the case that the threatened status of becoming minority and feeling minority in a country like the United States, where the demographic shift is inevitable, are elements that we would need to look at ethnographically to understand and hear it in the discourse, right? The Gaia principle, I think, was a pretty clean illustration. I agree that that it's one snapshot, in the same way in which one needs to question the illusions that we ourselves are creating, that Beauvoir created about gender or a certain binarity, right? That we create as we critique, that we would need to do that. And we would need to figure out kind of like where Gaia is going and what new myths are being used in the process. Okay, I will be quiet though, because there are a lot of hands.
Great, thank you so much. So we have a queue forming. Chiara Bottici, you're up first.
Hi, thank you so much for the very inspiring talk, and obviously all the hands raised. It's just because there's so much to be said. So I'll try to be brief. I just want to throw out this thought and see what you all want to do with it. It seems to me that this insisting on this distinction between myth and illusion perpetrates the idea that myth is something static, okay? So something that you can measure whether it is an illusion or not, because it's given at some point in time in a definitive form. But, you know, as Gramsci was saying, myths are not pieces of paper. So they're not something that is given and that can be measured against a reality that is separate from them as to whether they are illusionary or not. Myths are self-fulfilling. That's the problem. So, you know, to give your example, expropriated the expropriators as a political myth. Sorel said it very clearly, myths are determinations to act. So once you have expropriated all the capitalists, the myth is self-fulfilled. Or, you know, to give another example that I'm sure you're familiar with, Black people in the United States as being intrinsically violent, okay? All the mythology around the violent Black bodies, or all, which in some cases, it of course coagulates with other mythology, right? Let's take, you know, Black women or trans people, okay? Now, the moment when you read statistics and realize that, for instance, if you are a trans woman of color in the United States, you have basically 47 possibilities of ending up in jail at least once in your life, because all the trans women of color in the United States are 47% of them have spent at least some time in a prison, right? You turn them into dangerous people because you're imprisoning them, right? So in this sense, myth is self-fulfilling. It doesn't simply, I agree with what you said, that it does not aim to make a statement. We should not approach it as in having a claim to truth, but as something that aims at being self-fulfilling. And if that is the case, then I think, you know, the question is illusionary or not, and we can discuss how much the mega slogan was illusionary, but that's not the most important question. The most important question is, what kind of reality are they trying to create? And do we like that reality? So I think this shifts a bit the focus of the discussion, but, you know, I'm curious what you all think about this.
How do you want to proceed, Taeyun? Should we? Yeah.
Yeah, actually, let's start clustering questions, just in the interest of time. So, Pierre, you were up next, and Bernard, do you want to take questions in clusters of 2?
Well, yeah, or maybe we could have a conversation. I mean, yeah, we can turn this into a conversation if we could. That'd be good.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
So shall I ask? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think there is one fundamental myth from which almost all other myths are deriving from. The essential myth, I think, is that we come from an original time of happiness, which we have lost, and through sufferance, efforts, cleverness, we can try to gain it again. This is common to the lost Eden, or to the road that the psychoanalysis prescribes to come back to the pure happiness of childhood, ruined by other events. Unfortunately, this was also the main lead for the Nazi myth. So pure Germanity at the origin that can be conquered again, building a new Russian purity, let's say. Or also it's the base for good myths, good perspectives, like the egalitarian ones, the hope for a rational future based on equality, on scientific evidence, and so on. But I think this common origin of myths makes it very difficult for everybody to get rid of myths. Maybe the same Plato trying to found a rational philosophy drew on myths. And maybe one of these, that of the black horse and the white horse, is very meaningful. The black horse is somehow the function of myth. We cannot get rid of it, but maybe through a critical work, every myth can give us something positive. For example, the Gaia myth that you cited has a very peculiar origin with economical interests, but everybody today recognized the capacity of the Earth to find a new equilibrium. The point is that if humanity can be part of this new equilibrium. So do you think that myth is inevitable in our life, in our politics, and so on, in philosophy? But can we keep out of myth also good truth, like in this case?
Shall I respond there? Or sorry,
Go for it.
Okay, so all right, so I here's where all of our linguistic usage of myth becomes difficult, in part because we have in our minds certain ways that we think we're talking about them, and then that becomes, I think, difficult in terms of communicating. Chiara, you spoke about the idea of dangerousness, for instance, right? Particularly in terms of transgender persons being incarcerated, and they're emerging an idea of dangerousness. And I think you referred to it as a myth, as a self-fulfilling myth. Now, so this is where it feels as if it would be helpful not to salvage in the sense of valorizing, Matt, but to retain some distinctions here as to how these processes work. The idea of dangerousness, which emerges, say, in psychology in the 19th century, you all know what an article I'm referring to, emergence of the idea of dangerousness, Foucault's discussion of that, at least notions of monomania, etc. There's in that discussion, I think that's a particularly interesting discussion, which actually gets picked up again in the final lecture at Louvain, where these notions of dangerousness, monomania, of children being, of parents in their relationship to children being particularly dangerous, and these cases of monomania that he was studying, it seemed that it played on some kind of Hansel and Gretel or other or kind of myths, but it represented something at a particular time that I really wouldn't want to call a myth of dangerousness, or I wouldn't want to necessarily call that. Or for instance, the super predators in the 1990s that John Giulio created and that had such an important force in our discourse. I wouldn't call the super predators a myth. I would call it a construction, a political construction that was playing an extraordinarily important political role at that time, right? But I don't know if it helps us to call it a myth, because I would want to separate it from from myths that we read that dealt with extremely dangerous monsters, right? And somehow it helps. It would help me in, rather than lumping these together, to try to understand precisely in the way that Matt was suggesting, what are the at this moment struggles that would lead someone to come up with this illusion about super predators, juvenile super predators in the 1990s. And how did that pick up on some of the received understandings we had about from myth, from religion? I'd be happy to include that as well. Obviously, we could have a whole other conference on this, but from those stories to which we, again, and those stories are not self-fulfilling, I don't think. They are interpretations that we've agreed to in a way, or that are shared in the same way in which you, Chiara, speak about those shared meanings that you associate with political myth. I would say there are at times shared interpretations of I don't know, the Oedipus complex or something like that. Okay, all right, and are they inevitable, Pierre? And is there one myth? Boy, that was a wow, that really threw me off. That there's one myth that dominates. Oh, there you are. Sorry. That sounds mythic to me. But and as your screen share, your virtual screen share shows, that was highly mythic. But is it inevitable? I don't know. It's so powerful, right? It's so powerful. It's so powerful to be able to play on a single word, Mother Earth, Mother. We love it. Oh, I mean, I don't know. You know, I mean, that draws on an extraordinary amount of emotional capital that can be just deployed in just by Joseph Campbell in just 1 millisecond, right? So, okay, is it inevitable? I don't know.
In the interest of time, maybe we can have the next 3 questioners ask their questions together very, very briefly. And if we have time for Bernard to respond, that'll be wonderful. Otherwise, we might just leave the questions hanging in the ether, as it were. So next up, we have Robert, followed by Asaf and Isaac.
I think it's interesting to ask why the liberal marketplace of ideas fails to expose inauthentic or illusory myths. And I think of Roger Stone's book, The Myth of Russian Collusion, that once there's a story that Trump was in some conspiracy with Russia, then someone can write a book that the real conspiracy is the investigation or suspicion of the conspiracy. So where there's a story, one can always come up with a counter story. And of course, we know many intractable political disputes involve narrative and counter narrative. But could one imagine some utopia in which processes that find facts actually could expose them? I think Bernard gave an excellent kind of example of that, well, if we know Royal Dutch Shell is paying for it, that casts some, that loses its credibility, or if Putin was investing in Trump's projects, and if that fact could be proven, that might resolve like which of the alternate realities is the true one. But I think there's a problem because Bernard mentioned something like the myth is effective because it's believed. But an interesting thing about a lot of the Trumpist myths is many of the people who propound them do not believe them. And so I wonder if, because we're living in a post-Machiavellian world where one doesn't even, one has no interest in whether the myth is true or not. It's a question of whether it's useful to get people to believe it. And from that point of view, the more deceitful myth might have more power than the authentic myth.
Thank you, Asaf.
Thank you both for fascinating comments. I think one thing that we should raise here is how do people in this conversation use myth? And I think rather than assuming that we know what is myth, we can ask when it is used. And I think one thing that stood out for me is the othering use of myth. Myth is what you use in order to say something about what others take to be true, and you as reason deem as not plausible as truth. And I think I'm not saying that, of course, just in a general way, but that's part of how myth came into our modern world as a category that enables, as Matthew said, to salvage things which are not true but maybe beautiful or important. And the indistinction that we had in this conversation, to a certain extent, this was all the time the playground between myth and the political imaginary, or perhaps disagreement on, for example, the efficiency of a wall, for example. And of course, I'm probably with Matthew on the efficiency of the wall, but the fact of its inefficiency is debatable, right? So I think that's part of our conversation that should be at least critiqued.
Thank you, Isaac.
Thanks so much for your talk and for its reflexivity about the very possibility of the distinction that you're making and the debunking tradition, as you put it. I just have one particular part in what was an intricately constructed talk that I want to press on, which is the moment at which you're kind of doing a sociology of when the mythological background becomes the effective, historically situated illusion. And at some point you said that happens, partially one factor in the effectiveness is authenticity. And that made me think that, we have a tendency sometimes to use authenticity where maybe in other times, in other places, people might have said tradition. And I wanted to ask you about the term tradition, and what you think the role of tradition is in the perpetuation of stories, which you described as repeatedly effective and sort of codes that can be used in a particular way in a particular moment. It struck me that this might be a kind of very, very important question for your construction of the distinction between myth and illusion. That is, what is the relationship of each of them to something like received understandings, if that would be a definition of tradition, or whether you have something particular you'd like to say about the relationship of critique to tradition.
I will be really, really, really short, conscious of time, but Robert, the liberal marketplace of ideas. I'm not one of these people who watches podcasts, but for some reason I fell across this Radiolab piece about the way in which Holmes invented that notion, obviously drawing on Mill and whatnot, but the way in which he kind of like deployed that and the way in which it became dominant. So I stuck it in the chat, but it's a fascinating story. Of course, it's completely the illusion of free markets, right? The idea that speech would bubble, that truth would bubble to the top is precisely the illusion of free markets. But I did want to say that. More deceitfulness, less deceitfulness, I'm just not sure that those categories apply. Deceitful or not deceitful myth. It's our interpretations of them. And our instrumentalization. I agree completely, Asaf, that, and this is, of course, this was what the Enlightenment did, was that this notion of othering myth has such an extraordinary claim on our still contemporary conversation and understanding, which is why we use the term so often to reflect illusion simply. We use myth all the time as saying, it's the myth of this or the myth of that. Whereas here I'm in some way trying to retain some way of thinking about, of sharing in part about texts and traditions, Isaac, right? Texts and traditions that exist and that are studied in themselves. I will continue to think, Isaac, about the relationship between authenticity and tradition. It's interesting that tradition would come up in this context of critical theory, and so the place of tradition would be particularly provocative for us to think about in terms of the distinctions between traditional and critical theory. So I think I'll leave it at that and agree with Johanna in the chat, who is talking about the need to be careful in the way that we are using these terms, so that we, but that of course everyone has emphasized, at least in this room. Thank you so much, Jacob, Carmen, Dayun. Thank you for bringing us all together, and thank you, Matt, for your comments.
Thank you, Bernard and Matt, and thank you for the questioners. With apologies to Asaf, I think we're going to have to break now. Fortunately, we've eaten a bit into the break time, but if we could all meet back here at 35 minutes past the hour, that would be great. And we have the first panel to look forward to. Thank you again, Bernard.